Okay, so please take a seat. We'll get started with our morning keynote. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Driscoll, who's joining us from Seattle. Laura is starting her group at the Allen Institute for Neural Dynamics. She's also cross-appointed at the University of Washington. And Laura's been doing amazing work on try to understand the dynamics and the representations of neural networks. And today she's going to talk to us about fast and slow learning in artificial and biological networks. So please take it away.
Thanks, Guillaume, and thanks to the organizers for the invite. It's been really fun to be here. And I was thinking about how to put this talk in the context of the other talks, and I think it was especially relevant to some of the talks yesterday. So I put together an imagined skit between the speakers of the previous talks starring in the skit. So hopefully I'm representing your ideas well. And I won't ask you to come up and say your lines, I'll just say them quickly. Okay, so Carlos says, we should use artificial networks to learn what neurons encode. And then Mariam says, but Carlos, these neurons live in a behaving animal. Marine says, neural activity only makes sense in the context of a system that is guiding behavior. So yeah, I agree with Mariam. And then Irina says, a dynamical system that guides behavior. And Doina says, all of these behaviors can be divided into subtasks that rely on underlying shared structure. And so then now this is me saying, let's study the dynamical systems that implement compositional subtasks to better understand knowledge accumulation that guides generalization of behavior. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I also noticed that most of the women speakers are really aligned on dynamics and behavior. So I'm glad to be representing that perspective. So the main focus of my research group is about how previous experience shapes learning. I'm really interested in how knowledge is accumulated over the course of our lifetime. And building these structures of knowledge that can then be reused in novel situations. So, for example, you can rapidly learn a new card task if you've previously learned the structure of a card deck and other tasks. So how are we reusing this previously learned structure? It's still not well understood because while we've studied neural plasticity extensively in biological systems, we're still limited in our understanding of how this plasticity relates to these different timescales of fast and slow learning, in part because we're limited in terms of our access and control of the neural circuits that implement these kinds of computations. But I think more fundamentally, we're limited in terms of our hypotheses about how one network can learn multiple tasks to maximally reuse shared structure and also prevent interference between tasks that are interfering. So today I'll talk about an example of how dynamical systems that implement computation can be slowly learned and then rapidly repurposed in new contexts for fast learning. Okay, so the roadmap for today. I'll talk a little bit about my postdoc work where I studied multitask networks. And then I'll talk about how that's inspiring my current work, which is going to be to focus on curriculum learning and animal shaping experiments. And how that's related to work that's ongoing at the Allen Institute for the dynamical system for a bandit task, a two-armed bandit task. And then hopefully I'll have time for future directions. Okay, so to dive in, I'm going to talk about recurrent neural networks. So I want to motivate that a little bit. And today I'm going to make the argument that we should study these recurrent neural networks like any other model organism. So the biologists in the room will be familiar with this idea that there's an appropriate model organism for each biological question. And so you might study an owl if you want to study auditory processing, or a zebrafinch if you want to study learned behavior. So today I'll make the argument that we should treat these RNNs as just another model organism that we can use to develop intuitions for nonlinear dynamical systems. Okay, so like any other model organism, they come with their own set of challenges and benefits. So the RNNs that I'm going to talk about today are super abstract, really disconnected from biology, which makes it sometimes difficult to link directly to neural data. And they're missing a lot of the biological complexity. So, we're doing gradient descent, as Blake warned. It's far from the biology. Backprop through time, et cetera, et cetera. There's no spikes. These are all rate networks. But I think that simplicity allows us to deeply understand how these systems work. And I think you can also frame this as a benefit where we can add one biological constraint at a time and see how those constraints impact the way computations are performed so that we can build an understanding of how these different constraints change the types of neural dynamics that we see in the actual brain. Of course, we can monitor and perturb all of the units in the network. Importantly for this, we can train on multiple behavioral tasks, which can be difficult to train mice or monkeys to do. But I think really fundamentally, we can develop a mechanistic understanding of what it would mean to really understand how computations are implemented by dynamical systems and build up our hypotheses that we can then design experiments to test in biological systems. Okay, so I'm not the first person to do this. There's about a 10-year precedent or more of training recurrent networks to perform individual tasks and then studying the fixed point structures that implement those computations. So these fixed point structures are something that we now call dynamical motifs, and they're specific to the particular computation that you're studying. So for example, if you train a network to do an integration task where you need to accumulate noisy pulses of stimulus evidence over time, you're going to find a line attractor in some form in that network. Or if you train a network to do some binary decision task or a continuous stimulus categorization task, you're going to find some sort of unstable boundary where the state is going to evolve into two basins associated with either choice or category. And then in the case of a memory-guided response, you need to have some rotation of your memory into a different subspace, an output-potent subspace, which has non-zero outputs. Okay, so the gap in knowledge really, at this point, before I started this work, was, we understand these individual dynamical motifs for separate tasks, but how do these motifs interact within one network that can do many different kinds of computations? So in order to study this, we trained networks to do a bunch of cognitive tasks that people in neuroscience commonly study. Blake introduced some of these tasks already. And I'm not going to walk through each one of them because there are a bunch, but the key thing that you need to know is that some of these tasks share computational requirements. So they have similar computations, and some of them are interfering. And that was specifically how we wanted to design the set of tasks. And I'll just tell you the punchline right away. What we found is that these dynamical motifs form something of like computational building blocks that can be composed in different ways to build out more complex tasks in a compositional way. So for example, if you have two different tasks that both require integrating the same noisy stimulus, both of those tasks will reuse the same line attractor to do that computation. And if two other tasks need to categorize the same continuous stimulus into two discrete categories, they both will reuse the same decision boundary to do that computation, etc. So it's not trivial to understand how these dynamical motifs combine within a network, especially because they're specific to each particular task that we're studying. So that's why we do simulations in artificial networks and then study and reverse engineer those networks to study how they combine. Okay, so now I'm going to walk through the nitty-gritty a little bit. I mean, Blake kind of already introduced the idea of these tasks. They might be familiar to cognitive scientists in the room. I already said some share requirements, some are interfering, but I'll just give you a little flavor example of what that means. So there's a task that we call the memory pro task because it has a memory component and a pro response component. And so this is modeled after a behavioral task where an animal or a subject will have to focus on the white square on the center of the screen. And then a stimulus will appear in any direction on a circle. So here that stimulus is pointing to the right, but it could be in any direction. But the subject needs to maintain fixation on the little white square until it disappears, at which point it needs to look in the same direction as the stimulus. So that's a memory pro-response task. An interfering task would be the same exact setup of the inputs, except now there's a different context cue which tells the network to do the anti-response version of the task, and the subject needs to look in the opposite direction that the stimulus was pointing. Okay, so how do we translate that into inputs that go into a recurrent network? The first input is a fixation cue, so this is like the little white square. It tells the network, don't respond until this value goes to 0. So that's on throughout the trial until the go period. And then there's a stimulus input, which is an angle on a circle. We encode it in this two-dimensional vector that's sine and cosine of that angle. So in this case, there's no stimulus, and then it appears sine theta is close to 1. So it's pointing upward. And then there's a context input that is a one-hot vector. So it's a vector of length, the number of tasks the network is trained to perform, and all the values are close to 0, except for the one task where it's performing on this trial. And you'll notice that that's on throughout the duration of the trial, so it's always getting input that tells it which task it's performing. Now, if we look at the outputs, there's a fixation output, and then the response outputs, which are modeled in a similar way, sine and cosine of some angle. Okay, so you'll see this is a pro-response version of the task. So the network responds in the same direction as the stimulus. If it was an anti-response task, you would have a different context input for the one-hot input vector, and then the response would be pointing in the opposite direction. So that's how you model the different versions of the tasks. But these are some of the simpler tasks. There's a bunch of different versions where they have to compare two stimuli and things like that. Okay. So the other thing I want to highlight is we're studying dynamical systems. So these dynamical systems are reconfigured every time you change the inputs. So for each one of these task periods, when we change the value of what the inputs are, you're going to reconfigure the dynamics. You'll get a different set of fixed points. So we're going to study the dynamical systems for each one of these task periods separately. We're using standard methods in machine learning. We tried a bunch of different hyperparameters, so all the things that I'm going to tell you about today are consistent across GRUs or vanilla RNNs, etc. We use standard tools in machine learning like backprop, and we have activity regularization, which is a biological constraint which encourages the networks to find a more biologically realistic solution. Okay, so now we'll look and see what these activity patterns look like in the network. So I'm going to plot the evolution of the network state in principal component space defined by the variance of the state on one of the tasks. So these dimensions capture the maximal variance during the stimulus period of task 1, and then we're going to plot both tasks in that same subspace. So you can remember these two different tasks. They share a stimulus requirement where they both need to remember a stimulus orientation, but they need to do different things with that stimulus. Okay, so we're going to plot a bunch of different trials for both of these tasks in that same subspace, and we can see that they fan out in the same part of state space, such that you could use the same decoder to decode the stimulus orientation, regardless of which task the network is actually performing. And if we look at the fixed point structures, during the memory period, the following memory period, we can see that there's a ring of fixed points that are holding the network state in place across both of these tasks. And so now when we interpolate between the rule input across both of these tasks, we're interpolating between the one hot vector of both of those tasks. You can see that those fixed points are in approximately the same part of state space across both of those tasks. So here I'm plotting it in another dimension where you have the rule input along your third axis, and you can see that this same ring continues to exist across all intermediate input conditions. So this is something like an empirical bifurcation diagram for those that are familiar, but the key thing here is that there are no bifurcations. So it's actually just the same ring attractor that just continues to exist across both tasks. So that's what I mean when I say that these ring attractors are shared across tasks. Now similarly, if I were to interpolate between two tasks that need to categorize a continuous stimulus, now you have two shared point attractors that are reused across both of those two category tasks. And now if I walk along one of the fixed points, so I don't know if you can see my mouse, but No. Okay. So if you walk along one of the fixed points, one of these two shared fixed points across both tasks, and you look at the Jacobian of the state transition function at that point in state space as you do the interpolation, you see that not only are these stable fixed points continuing to exist for each intermediate input condition, but they have really similar dynamics in every dimension of state space. So they're contracting in a pretty similar way. And you can see that in this eigenspectrum where there's a continuity in the eigenvalues across these fixed points. And the key thing that you want to see here is that you have this continuity of the eigenvalue as you do the interpolation, where there's a smooth gradient between the values for one task all the way to when you interpolate for the other task. Now, if you were to do the same thing across two motifs that are not shared, you get something that looks really different, which is an eigenspectra that has all these fragments in it, which if you can imagine, if you're walking in a high dimensional state space and then all of a sudden something totally changes and there's a cliff in the dynamics, so something really drastically different happens as in this high dimensional space. And you can see a key feature of bifurcation is that you go from a stable point to having unstable points, so you can see that along the unity circle, and then here is one of those fragments of eigenvalues where you don't have that continuity of the eigenvalues as you do in the interpolation. Okay, so that's the key sort of punchline of like these dynamical motifs as being shared, and what I mean when I say that. We're now kind of working on better understanding why the fixed points end up being shared. I should also say this work was basically reproduced in Omri Barak's group with Elia Turner. And so they've contributed a bit to better understanding that the state is just going to the same region of state space and then reusing the fixed points that are there through gradient descent. There's still some gaps in understanding why this is actually happening. So we're continuing to work on it. I'm collaborating with Eric Shea Brown and Ellie Schleiserman at UW, who are in applied math. We have a grad student, James Hazelden, who's working on this. And we think right now that it might have something to do with the strength of the recurrent weight matrix. And we're examining the algorithm of backproc through time to better understand how this continuation of fixed points is happening over the course of training and across tasks. And so we think it might be related specifically to this rich learning paradigm. Okay, the summary of findings from this section. These dynamical motifs are modular fixed point structures capable of implementing a specific computation. They're reused across tasks. I didn't get to tell you about this today, but subpopulations of neurons implement the motifs, but this depends on the nonlinearity, the alignment of the motifs to the units, which is all in the paper which is published now. There's also these lesion results that highlight the modularity of these motifs. But the last part I want to talk to you about from this paper is that we found faster learning was possible by reusing these previously learned motifs. Okay, so this is like one of the most interesting parts of this work that I wanted to follow up on in my own research group. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the relationship to continual learning in this fast learning setup. Okay, so this is fundamentally a transfer learning experiment. Sorry, I'm so thirsty. Okay, so in the first stage of learning, you pre-train a network on a subset of tasks where you learn all of the weights in the network. And then in the second stage, you're only learning this new one hot context input for a new context. And so one thing that's really cool about this setup is that when you fix all the rest of the weights in the network, you don't have to worry about catastrophic forgetting anymore, because you're not changing any of the weights that are related to any of the other tasks the network performed. So if you pre-train the network on subsets of tasks that either contain relevant dynamics or don't contain relevant dynamics. So we're going to do a few different conditions of different subsets of tasks. So in the first group, we're not going to do any pre-training. We're just randomly initializing these networks. And in the second stage, in the second group, we're going to pre-train on a delay pro and a memory pro task. So you can think of this network as a reservoir that contains the pro response and the memory the memory motifs. And then in the last group, we're going to pre-train on the delay anti-task and the memory pro task. So in this last group, you can think of it now as a reservoir that contains the pro motif, the memory motif, and an anti-response motif. And we're going to see how well each one of these groups do in a second stage of learning, where we're training each one of these networks by only changing the context inputs on a held out memory anti-task, which you might guess requires the memory and anti-motifs. Okay, so how well do each one of these groups do? Networks that didn't have any pre-training, so there's no motifs in these networks, they're just randomly initialized, were never able to learn the held out task. So they just don't have that interesting enough or useful enough dynamics within those networks to just be able to do this based on a context input. Now, if we compare that to networks that already have the memory and pro-response motifs, we see that they're eventually able to learn the held out task, but it takes a long time and there's a great deal of variability. Now, if we look at our last group that already has all the motifs it already needs to perform this held out task, we can see that it is almost immediately able to just implement these previously learned motifs in a new way. So reconfiguring them together in a new way. And so we can look at the fixed point structures and see exactly how these are implemented in the new task. So in our case where we already had all the motifs we need, as we interpolate across the rule input for the delay ante, the previously learned delay ante, and the new memory ante task, we can see that there's the same stable fixed point that's just dragging the state in either case. So it's very simple, it's just one fixed point that gets reused during that stimulus period. And if we compare that to our networks that didn't have the anti-motif, they were pre-trained on the delay pro task, they have the pro motif, but we're now going to interpolate to the memory anti-task, so an anti-response task during the stimulus period in these networks. And what we see is something really crazy, where what is actually going on here is the ring attractor that was learned for doing the memory computation is altered such that the state gets pulled in the opposite direction. So what's actually happening is instead of the white arrow that's pointing upward, which is the delay pro task, now in the condition for the memory anti-task, the bottom of the ring gets stabilized, so there becomes one single stable fixed point at the bottom of the ring, and so now the state gets dragged in the other direction, and now the network can perform both of these tasks depending on which side of the ring attractor the state falls on. And in either one of these cases, you can see that during the memory period, the same ring attractor was easily reused, which again is highlighting the modularity. So regardless of whether you could just reuse a stimulus motif or you had to modify a previously learned stimulus motif, the ring attractor is reused in the memory period either way. Okay, so this is the key thing that highlights how previously learned tasks can shape the particular dynamical solution that gets learned in these networks, which Matt Perrick highlighted in his question period that Dave Friedman's group at UChicago has some data from monkeys basically showing this is true. Based on the training history, this particular behavioral strategy that the animal uses might be slightly different. So I'm really excited about the idea of studying this further in recurrent networks and in animals to better understand how past experience and previous training builds up the structures of knowledge, which are the set of dynamical motifs that the networks and the animals have access to change the way they perform a particular computation, which could then guide our understanding of differences between different animals based on their training history or just based on the particular solutions for individual tasks that they found. Which is really nice to do at the Allen Institute because they have a lot of mice that we can compare between each other. So like hundreds of mice doing this dynamical, doing this Bandit task, which I'm going to talk about briefly now. I think I have like some time left. Okay. So the goal here is going to be to study how curricula shape dynamical motif learning. So our approach will be to train RNNs to perform a particular task of interest, then learn the dynamical motifs underlying that task, and compare the dynamics in the RNN to the dynamics in brains of mice at the Allen Institute or monkeys in collaboration with Amy Orsborn at UW, or humans in collaboration with Sergei Stavitsky at UC Davis. Okay, and then we will investigate the relationship between the learned dynamics and the curricula that each one of these groups experienced. Okay, so specifically at the Allen Institute, we're focusing on this task where mice are trained to either lick a port on the left or the right, and the probability of reward on either one of these ports is varying in time. So yeah, there's a go cue, and then they just have to choose whether it's left or right, and then they get rewarded with some probability. And here you can see that the probability of reward for both the left and the right ports is changing in time throughout the session. But yeah, okay, so then now if we just look at the animal's behavior overlapped with the probability of reward on either side, that as the probability is more likely to come from the left, the animal licks to the left. If it's more likely to come from the right, the animal licks to the right. They know how to do the task. But one thing I want to highlight here is that this particular version of the task, the reward probability on either side is uncoupled, which means there's two different probabilities that determine whether you get reward on the left or the right. And there's Brownian motion over those two probabilities. So there isn't any kind of temporal structure in that the dynamic probability of reward on either side, which is going to be relevant later. Okay, so Po Chen is a great student working with Edgar Walker at UW. And when I arrived at the Allen Institute, he was already training these actor-critic networks to perform this task. And similar to the mice, the networks were able to learn this task. But I asked Po Chen, what are the networks doing? Let's crack them open. So now we're reverse engineering these networks to better understand what are the dynamical motifs that are implementing this computation. And here again, you can see probability of reward. The long ticks are reward. The small ticks are error, which just shows the network is doing the task well. And now if we look at the, okay, and then here for this particular version, there are block switches where there's a uniform, so in this case, the reward is coupled, so there's one probability that determines whether there's reward. And so the left and the right always sum to 1. And so we call that coupled. And then the probability of the block switch is happening with a uniform distribution centered on 40 trials. Okay, so there's these different kinds of design choices that were happening across the mice and the networks that weren't necessarily aligned. And so this is going to come up later. Okay. So now if we look at the network state dynamics in principal component space, we can see that the evolution of the state through time is following this little structure, this little worm moving around state space. And I'm coloring the dots according to the probability of the network either choosing right or left. So when it's red, it means the network is going to the right. When it's blue, the network is going to the left. So you can see that there's some structure here where I'll highlight all the different states. You can see more clearly that blue is all on one side and red is all on the other side. And so if we reverse engineer these networks to understand the dynamics that are implementing this computation, we can see that there's actually two different components to the way these networks are solving it. There's actual integration, where the network is integrating this noisy input of whether they're rewarded or not. And then there's also this timing-based component. Okay, so the timing-based component is along the circumference of this ring, like a clock. On average, the trial switch happens about every 40 trials. So the network can learn this prior structure where it can expect that if it just had a block switch, it's probably not going to have another block switch in the immediate future. So if it gets an error right after it did a block switch, it can know that it's just because the probability of reward is less than 100% on the highly rewarded side. Okay, and there are these additional integration parts along the center that are actually integrating the amount of evidence for whether it's the right or the left side. So there's these two different components of how the task is being performed. And our goal here will be to relate the learning of each one of these motifs to stages of curricula of the mice. So the mice have been all over the place. Some of the mice have gotten these block switch structures, and other mice have experienced the Brownian motion version of the task. And so our goal will be to study how that training history of the mice impacted the particular underlying dynamical motifs that you might see in the network. Okay, so now if we look at the fixed points, these are the slow points underlying the network. For the condition, as you remember, every time you change the inputs, you change the fixed point structures. So now if we look in the case of 0 action and 0 reward, this is our manifold of slow points. And we interpret this to be something like 3 different line attractors that are actually doing the integration at the transition periods from when the block switch is expected to be happening. And then now if we look for each one of the conditions where the animal chose a particular side and either got rewarded or not, you end up with these 4 stable points, which I'm highlighting here in green, that are stable in every dimension. So they're attracting the state in every dimension and sort of dragging the state around this ring in state space. And I just wanted to highlight, in addition to the actual line attractors and stable fixed points, all these additional slow points, which might actually have a really interesting relationship to one another. If you look on the right-hand side, you can actually trace out the connections between each one of the fixed points through the slow points of the network. And so that's a future direction of study. But for now, we'll just focus on the slowest points, the stable fixed points, and see here, I'm going to skip through this kind of quickly, but there's this decision plane that decides whether the network goes to the right or the left. On the beginning, if it's on that side, it goes to the left. If it's on that side, it goes to the right. At the beginning of a session, the state starts in the center, and if it picks the right side and doesn't get rewarded, it gets dragged to this upper right stable point. And then it's going to keep choosing left until and keep getting rewarded. And as that's happening, it's being dragged to the fixed point at the bottom. And then eventually it's going to stop being rewarded for the left side. So it's going to choose left and get no reward, at which point it's going to be dragged to this other stable fixed point on the left, etc. And so you can see how that's happening. That's what's pulling the state around this ring. But this particular solution is brittle to drastically different block lengths. So if we give the network a much longer than expected block length, so instead of, on average, 40 trials, it gets a 200 trial block, you can see that at about 40 trials, it's starting to expect that it's going to make a switch. But it doesn't. So we look and see what's happening in the state trajectory. It starts in the center, it wraps around, and it eventually gets to this stable fixed point. And then it's sort of expecting a block switch is going to happen. And as soon as it gets an error, it sort of falls down to the other side, to the red side, but then gets pulled back around when it gets red errors back to this other stable fixed point. And then eventually wraps back around to the initial stable fixed point that it was held at, and eventually crosses when the block switch actually happens at 200. So I know this is a lot and I went through it kind of quickly, but the key thing here is just that by studying the attractor structures that these networks learned, we can make explicit predictions about the kinds of errors that animals might make if they had the same underlying fixed point structures that were performing the computation in their brains. Okay, so the key thing here is to have this tight loop between our simulations and experiments, where we can ask this question of how different timing curricula that the mice experienced lead to different dynamical solutions, and make very explicit predictions about the types of errors that the animals might make. And then similarly, we can do experiments that can guide the way these networks learn and how plastic they are. So I'm really interested in the flexibility of of brains. And so one question that I'm really interested in is how rapidly are the brains of mice and monkeys and humans able to adapt to new block lengths in order to update their strategy and change their motifs. So, and maybe that can guide the plasticity that we design into artificial networks. Okay, I've been kind of hinting this whole time about how the particular differences in the task design might change the dynamical motifs that implement computation. So I've been highlighting this particular ring structure in a task where there's a lot of structure in the temporal, in the timing of when the block switches happen, and the coupled relationship between the reward probability on the left and right arms. So you end up with this particular structure, but I mentioned in the beginning that some of the mice were trained on a version of the task where there's Brownian motion over the reward probabilities, and that the reward is uncoupled. So I want everyone to just sit here for a moment and close your eyes and imagine what you might expect the evolution of the state to look like if there's no temporal structure in the task and the probability of reward on either side doesn't have any relationship to each other. So some people have to train a full network to be able to learn these motifs, but maybe with the power of your brain, you can imagine what it should look like. So that's one thing that I think is really cool. After having a lot of experience with these networks, you can develop those sorts of intuitions, and it can change the way that you think about computation just by some familiarity with the types of motifs that are necessary for computation. So maybe at this point you've discovered or made the prediction that you might see something like a plane attractor, which is exactly what we found in the networks, where the state now doesn't have any of that temporal structure, so it can't predict when the timing switches happen, and instead you have to integrate the reward probabilities for both left and right sides independently along two orthogonal axes that are not interfering. And then you can collapse that state onto one line attractor that is the difference in reward probability across both of those arms. And that's exactly what we find in the network. So this is just to highlight that these subtle differences in the design of the tasks will change the dynamical systems that implement these computations. And so now we're more tightly linking the models to the animal's behavior and tracking the animal's history across these different versions of the tasks. Okay, so this is really early days for this work. As Guillaume said, I just started at the Allen Institute this year, but we're interested in continuing this sort of idea of how curricula shape motif structure in RNNs. I think we actually have really explicit things to say about why gradual change eases task learning, because you're dragging fixed points to new locations slowly over time, which is much easier to do in gradient descent than just rapidly forming some new motif out of nothing. I think we can test the effects of curricula through the behavioral errors in both the RNNs and the mice or humans. One thing that's cool about behavioral tasks, testing your hypotheses, is you have more freedom to do it in different setups. And then, I guess, inspired by where we are, I wanted to mention at least something about thinking about motifs as a potential token for dynamics, and how I want to encourage people to think about how these tokens are formed and can evolve and change as we're accumulating knowledge that can be reused in novel situations. And I think this is likely hierarchical, so there probably isn't one motif size, but sort of a whole structure of them. Okay, how much time do I have left? Okay. Okay. I'm just going to fly through this fairly quickly. In general, the title of this talk was Fast and Slow Learning in Biological and Artificial Systems. So that's what I think about a lot. And I talked a lot about how networks do computation through dynamics, but I'm really interested in how it happens in the brain. That's fundamentally what motivates me. And I think that, as I said, that through behavioral comparisons, we can really test these predictions in neural systems. And I'm really interested in how these dynamical systems are learned and maintained over time, over many different timescales. So the dynamical systems in our brain are like a kaleidoscope of orders of magnitude of difference in time and also space. And so they're all happening on top of each other, which is kind of beautiful and intimidating to think about. So if we think of this full spectrum of how all these dynamical systems are learned, on the very slowest end all the way to the fastest end, I put up a spectrum here. The slowest, people always talk about how humans are so able to rapidly learn, or biological systems can learn really quickly, but oftentimes they're excluding all of evolution, which has set these systems up with really good pre-trained networks to be able to learn things rapidly. And I think we should take advantage of that structure that evolution has informed us is really useful. People are very skeptical of how much AI can actually learn from neuroscience, but I think it's underutilized in terms of thinking about the particular connectivity and the initializations that our networks have. Over the course of development, I'm super interested in critical periods. If you haven't heard of that, ask me about it, because I love to talk about it. And I think that's another way that AI can learn from biological systems. Like, we accumulate knowledge over the course of our lifetime, and we become specialized for specific things that we need to do a lot of. And I think critical periods have a really interesting thing to say about that. Curriculum learning on the shorter time scale is what I talked about mostly today, and then in-context learning, obviously, was like the transfer learning experiment that I talked about. Okay, so today I told you about dynamical systems that implement computation. They can be slowly learned and then rapidly repurposed in new contexts. And in general, I think that's an interesting way to frame thinking about how previously learned behaviors shape our behavior in this moment now. Okay. This is more about the evolution idea. There's a grad student I'm working with Adrian Fairhall about having informed priors on network structure and using something like critical periods to develop networks that have modules that are hierarchically organized. And I'm working with Cindy Poo to develop much more complex behaviors for mice to perform. Turns out mice are really good at learning odor-based navigation tasks, so you can train them to do those tasks very rapidly, much more rapidly than like moving grading tasks. And so in this setup, the animal is running on a treadmill, and we've got screens, and it's like measure everything, put EMGs in the body, like measure the sniffing, and so it's like try to measure as much as you possibly can and give like a really complex environment to an animal where they have to accumulate knowledge and apply things to new settings. So happy to talk more about the types of behaviors we're brainstorming. And I'll just end on a quick summary. I talked about reuse of attractors across tasks, the relationship to curriculum learning, timing and integration for a Bandit task, and this fast and slow task learning paradigm. So I want to thank my postdoc advisors who were absolutely wonderful in guiding the research that I talked about in the first half of the talk, and some of our other collaborators and people that I've talked to a lot about the work. And I also want to thank the amazing Seattle neuroscience community. It's really incredible. There is a big focus on dynamical systems there, so if that's what you're interested in, check it out. University of Washington, Allen Institute. There's also AI2, which is there. So come talk to me if you're interested about that. And thanks all of you for your attention.
Right. Thank you, Laura, for the wonderful talk. I can attest to the dynamical systems and richness of the Seattle community. Let's take a few questions. Alex? Yeah.
Hi, Laura. Really cool stuff. I was wondering for the Bandit RNNs that you ended up with, have you compared it to like classical computer science Bandit algorithms, like also for reversal learning and so on, to sort of see on the one hand how well your RNN performs against it, but also more from the interpretability side, like whether you can actually tie your algorithm that you discovered in your dynamical patterns to more classical computer science algorithms.
So when you say classical, you mean like Q-learning paradigms?
Like, for example, Thomson sampling or something like for normal Bandit learning, but then the whole reversal, like reward reversal. I'm not super familiar with the field, but I know there's also like a whole bunch of theoretical computer scientists very passionate about this problem that also have designed algorithms and so on for it.
Yeah, I'd be curious to talk more about the details of what you mean, but like in terms of like a Q-learning model, we can show that the networks are able to take more advantage of the like priors of task structure than a simple Q-learning model can. And there's actually this really interesting result that they found when they looked across like a bunch of the mice that are doing these different versions of this task. There is like this inverse, this inverse relationship where like if you put the Q-learning model's ability to predict neural activity on one axis, and then the foraging efficiency on the other axis. The mice that are the best foragers have the worst Q-learning model. So that means that they are able to take advantage of the structure and priors of the task that a Q-learning model can't incorporate.
I see. Super cool. Thanks.
Yeah.
Take a question from Doina.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great talk. Really appreciate the dynamical systems perspective there. I'm wondering about the Bandit task as opposed to looking at more sequential decision-making tasks, and whether you think that some of the perhaps hierarchical structure that you anticipate to be there would require going to richer space of tasks.
Yeah, so I mean, the Bandit task was the task of the day at the Allen Institute when I arrived. So it wouldn't have been the task that I particularly set out to study. But I am currently in the process of designing these types of hierarchically designed navigation tasks with Cindy, where in that paradigm, basically, we're still brainstorming what exactly the task we want to do is now. It's intimidating to be okay, now 100 people are going to work on this, and we're going to spend many years on it. But in that particular setup, the animal is running on a linear track, and they can make their decision by stopping. So there's a huge space of things that you can do with that, where maybe if you get a particular stimulus and the animal stops, then they enter in a different world where 2 other possibilities of odors could be presented. And so they can make more long-term decisions based on which odors they stop for, in the first layer of the hierarchy. So that's one thing we're thinking about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Take a question from Paul.
Yeah, so that was super cool. And I'm actually very excited about the idea of looking at errors. But then I wonder, because what you described there is you train the networks with essentially a supervised learning. You give them sort of a desired output. But presumably, you could do this with reinforcement learning, and likewise arrive at motifs, which I don't know, tell me, but would they be similar motifs if the system arrives at them through a more of a reinforcement trial and error type of approach? And if so, then along the way, will it get sort of stuck in certain superstitions, much like animals do when they train? They get sort of stuck in a rut, and it takes a while before they get out of that rut. And have you tried that? And if so, have you seen anything like that?
So the whole first half of the talk was supervised learning
Right.
in RNNs. The whole second half was all about actor-critic setup, which is trained through reinforcement learning. So we still see the same kinds of dynamical motifs emerge in either condition. I think the key thing is actually gradient descent. So in terms of superstitions, that's exactly what the prediction is that things that you learned previously are going to impact the particular solution that you find on a later stage of training. So if you have a particular notch in the dynamics that you learned for one setting, we might expect the same, eccentricity or something in the trajectory in a later stage because you're reusing the same underlying flow fields.
And have you compared that to the mice?
So we are currently in the process of doing that. The mouse data that we have so far is all behavioral with some perturbation data, but not neural recordings. They also have neuromodulators that they're recording. So all of this is being scaled up. The Neural Dynamics Institute is only 2 years old, so it's brand new setup.
Take one last question from Smita.
Super cool talk again. So I'm going to ask sort of a 2-part question. So I come from more of a representation learning framework, and we've been learning geometric topological representations of neural dynamics. And we're kind of seeing the same thing geometrically, that there are some motifs, if you will, that are repeated. And I was trying to think of the connection between the ones you're seeing from dynamic systems analysis and the ones I'm seeing. Maybe they're the same thing, maybe they're not, but I started to wonder if some of what I see are transitions rather than fixed points also. So is there a reason why you're sort of tokenizing your dynamics with fixed points? Should you also do them with transitions? And do you have any thoughts about the topological ones I'm seeing versus the ones you're seeing?
Yeah, okay, so the tokenization thing was just maybe some people should think about this, but I'm not actually working with tokens.
I'm just using that word to mean, you said your dynamics consist of a bunch of fixed points. So I'm saying, why not the transitions?
Right, so the key element of computation that we're focusing on is like the slow points and attractor structures and things like that because of the specific cognitive tasks that we're studying. So for doing working memory or integration or things like that, those are the relevant bits of computation. But there are other kinds of tasks, like reaching tasks or more dynamic tasks where you're having like constantly changing inputs. And in that context, it doesn't make any sense to look at the particular dynamical system for a fixed set of inputs. So I think, like, I actually don't think there are probably like any fixed points in the actual brain, and most things are like approximate fixed points or slow points or manifolds. And I think it's likely that the underlying dynamics that are getting reused across these different tasks, like we're just focusing on the fixed points because they're easy to quantify and compare, and you can make bifurcation diagrams with them. But I think it's likely that it's like the full dynamical flow field that is actually being reused and is the same across tasks, which you can kind of see in like the full, like the eigenspectrum for the Jacobian of the state transition function. Like it looks smooth in every dimension of state space. So I will just say that like we're focusing on these attractor structures because they're easy to talk about, but we should work on a way to scale outside the comfort zone of linear systems and move into nonlinear systems.
Thank you.
Okay, please join me in thanking Laura once more.